On a cold, gray morning, February 13th, 1542, the Tower of London stood solemn beneath the heavy winter sky. Within its ancient stone walls, a young woman of only 19 years was preparing to face the unimaginable. Catherine Howard, once Queen of England, now walked the final steps of her life toward the scaffold, her slender hands clutching a small prayer book, her eyes clouded with fear and disbelief. The night before, in an act that haunts history, she had requested the execution block to be brought to her cell. Alone in the silence of her chamber, she practiced placing her head upon it again and again, desperately trying to meet death with some measure of grace. It was not just a sign of preparation, but a chilling portrait of a heart that had long lost hope. How cruel is fate that a girl who danced through palace halls just 18 months earlier, adored by a king and praised for her beauty, now stumbled through stone corridors, her feet heavy with dread. Catherine had been called Henry VIII's rose without a thorn, yet thorns were all that awaited her in the end: betrayal, shame, and steel. As she reached the scaffold, the memories must have swirled the whispered laughter of courtly love, the golden days of youth, the faces of those she trusted who sealed her fate. She had been reckless, perhaps naive, but not monstrous, only tragically human in a world where a queen's slightest misstep meant death. Trembling beneath the weight of history and fear, Catherine looked out at the silent crowd. Her final words, simple yet haunting, would echo through centuries: "I die a queen, but I would rather die the wife of Culpepper." In that moment, she was no longer royalty or traitor, just a broken girl longing for a love that had cost her everything. And when the axe fell, it was not only a life that ended, but the last breath of innocence in a court that knew none. She died not with pride, but with the echo of sorrow that would stain the walls of the tower forever. In the summer of 1540, the embers of one royal marriage barely had time to cool before another was kindled, this time not with a noble match from across the seas, but with a young girl who radiated life and laughter. Henry VIII, aging weary and bitter from failed unions, had just annulled his fourth marriage. At 49, his leg oozing from a painful ulcer and his heart heavy with disillusionment, the once powerful monarch seemed unlikely to fall in love again. But then came Catherine Howard, just a girl barely out of her teens with no royal blood or political pedigree. Yet there was something about her, a brightness, a musical laugh, the easy way she danced through rooms as if the burdens of the court could never touch her. She was everything Henry was not: youthful, vivacious, unscarred by disappointment. To him, she must have seemed like a vision, a second chance at joy in his final years. Just 19 days after his marriage to Anne of Cleves was dissolved, he claimed Catherine as his bride. He called her his rose without a thorn, believing he had at last found purity and perfection in a court so often riddled with deceit. But beneath the surface of this whirlwind, love lay fragility. Catherine had not been raised in the polished halls of royalty, but in the chaotic household of her grandmother, where rules were loose and watchful eyes were few. She had known affection, perhaps even love, long before the king ever noticed her, and these secrets, buried beneath silks and jewels, waited quietly to rise. Still, for a fleeting moment, she was queen. Draped in finery, crowned in youth and charm, Catherine basked in a dangerous kind of happiness. The king, in turn, was enchanted, blind to the quiet tide already turning beneath his feet. Theirs was a love born not of understanding, but of illusion, a fragile bloom in winter, destined to wither the moment truth touched its petals. Before she ever stepped into the gilded halls of Hampton Court, before her name was etched into the chronicles of queens, Catherine Howard was simply a girl, young, impressionable, and achingly human. Raised not in the disciplined care of royal tutors, but in the noisy, unsupervised chambers of her grandmother's chaotic household, Catherine's world was one of whispered laughter, secret glances, and youthful longing. There, tucked away from the scrutiny of courtly eyes, she experienced the messy, confusing beginnings of love, first with Henry Mannix, her music tutor, whose affections crossed into dangerous territory, and later, more seriously, with Francis Derham, a man who called her wife in the shadows of the maiden's dormitory. To Catherine, these were not calculated affairs. They were moments of stolen warmth, of a teenager seeking affection in a world that offered little guidance. She had no reason then to believe that every touch and promise would one day rise like ghosts in judgment against her. When she arrived at court, a place of pageantry and polished manners, those memories were buried beneath fine gowns and royal titles. She carried them like fragile shards tucked beneath lace, hoping they would never be found. But the past has a cruel way of catching up, especially in a palace where secrets echo louder than truth. When whispers of her youthful indiscretions began to resurface, it wasn't just her reputation at stake, it was her very life. What had once been innocent flirtations were now twisted into accusations of deceit and betrayal. In a court where appearances were everything, and purity was demanded of a queen, Catherine's past became her noose. She was never taught how to navigate power, never warned that love could be weaponized. The world expected her to behave like a monarch while still treating her like a girl. And when her history emerged, they didn't see a child who once longed for affection, they saw a traitor. And so the past she tried to forget became the spark that would ignite her tragic fall. Surrounded by opulence but starved of affection, Queen Catherine Howard was caught between two worlds, one of royal duty and one of forbidden desire. Her husband, King Henry VIII, was no longer the virile monarch of youth. At 49, plagued by a festering leg ulcer and carried from chamber to chamber in pain, he represented everything cold and distant in Catherine's new life. The once playful energy of her marriage had dulled under the weight of royal expectations and physical revulsion. In the hushed halls of the palace, Catherine began to wither not from lack of power, but from lack of love. Then came Thomas Culpepper, young gallant and dangerously handsome. A gentleman of the king's privy chamber, he moved through the court with ease, his charm lighting corners where Catherine's hope had long dimmed. What began as lingering glances became stolen notes, then hushed conversations in moonlit corridors. In Culpepper, Catherine didn't merely see a lover. She saw escape affirmation youth, all the things that had been denied her. Their love bloomed in the shadows, not just from desire, but desperation. Ironically, the woman who facilitated their doomed meetings was Jane Boleyn's sister-in-law, to the executed Anne Boleyn, Catherine's own cousin, who had once fallen from grace under eerily similar circumstances. History, it seemed, was repeating itself with cruel precision. These moments with Culpepper weren't just acts of infidelity. They were Catherine's fragile grasp at feeling alive. But every secret encounter, every whispered vow, brought her closer to disaster. In a court fueled by whispers and betrayal, there are no secrets for long. Catherine's heart, tender and reckless, beat too loudly for the world she lived in. What she saw as love, others would call treason. And when her words to Culpepper, "I wish I were in your arms," were uncovered, they didn't just betray her secrets. They sealed her fate. What begins in shadows always finds its way into the light. For Catherine Howard, the delicate illusion of safety she had constructed began to crumble in the autumn of 1541. A quiet whisper from John Lascelles, a reformist with ties to her past, set off the chain of events that would end not only her reign, but her life. He approached Archbishop Cranmer with truths that had long slept beneath layers of royal silks, tales of past lovers, youthful recklessness, and forbidden passions. Cranmer, hesitant but bound by duty, dared not speak the words to Henry directly. Instead, he left a letter sealed, trembling with the accusation, upon the king's private pew in the chapel. When Henry VIII broke the seal and read the contents, it wasn't just disbelief that crossed his face, it was devastation. His rose without a thorn had thorns after all. The woman he believed to be pure, untouched, and devoted had offered her heart and body to another. And the proof, a letter written in Catherine's own hand, tender yet damning. "My heart and body are at your disposal. I wish I were in your arms." With those words, love turned to fury. The aging king, once so infatuated, now felt the sting of betrayal as deeply as any sword. He ordered an immediate investigation, desperate for the accusations to be lies. But truth came rushing in like a flood. Servants spoke, witnesses testified, secrets unraveled, and each confession etched another crack into the king's already broken heart. Catherine had not just betrayed her vows, she had shattered the image Henry clung to in his twilight years, that he could still inspire devotion, still command youthful affection. Now, instead of love, there was betrayal. Instead of a queen, a traitor. The palace turned cold. The corridors, once filled with music, now echoed with dread. Catherine, still cloaked in royal silk, had unknowingly sewn her own execution shroud with ink passion and one fatal letter. The crown slipped from her head long before the axe fell. Stripped of her title, dragged from royal grace to royal disgrace, Catherine Howard, barely more than a child, now faced the weight of a nation's judgment. There was no trial, no courtroom defense, no chance for mercy. Parliament passed a brutal law. It was now treason for a queen to hide her past, even her thoughts. A kiss from years ago, a love letter never meant for a king. These became the nails in her coffin. In the Tower of London, where time moved like a slow executioner's blade, Catherine waited. The young girl once adored and adored in return was now alone in stone walls that echoed with her cousin Anne Boleyn's final prayers. Catherine had danced through court life like a flame brief and beautiful, but now that flame was smothered by law and steel. Her two lovers paid a gruesome price. Francis Derham, the man of her youth who once whispered vows of love in the dark dormitory, was hanged cut open and quartered while still breathing. His screams echoed through the city. Thomas Culpepper, the one she wished to die beside, was granted the mercy of a beheading. But mercy had no place for Catherine. February 13th, 1542. She was led to the scaffold near the resting place of Anne Boleyn. Witnesses said she could barely stand her body trembling with the weight of terror and regret. Yet in the last moment she found her voice, "I die a queen, but I would rather die the wife of Culpepper." And then silence. One stroke of the axe, and the girl who once danced in velvet was gone. Buried without ceremony beside her cousin, remembered not as a queen but as a warning. A rose without a thorn. Number, just a girl in a cruel garden of power, punished for blooming in the wrong season. I die a queen, but I would rather die the wife of Culpepper. With those haunting words, Catherine Howard sealed her legacy not as a monarch's consort, but as a woman who dared to love in a court ruled by fear. They were words not of defiance, but of longing spoken by a girl barely out of childhood, caught between a crown too heavy and a heart too full. In the cold gray morning of February 13th, 1542, she walked to the scaffold not as royalty, but as a tragic figure stripped of titles yet filled with a clarity few ever find the truth of who she had loved. Her voice did not tremble. She had practiced this moment, placing her head on a wooden block the night before, determined to meet death with grace, or at least with dignity. She had no illusions left. Her name had been dragged through dirt, her love letters exposed her body, imprisoned her spirit broken. Yet in that final moment she chose honesty. Not for Henry, not for history, but for herself. To admit love for Culpepper, even as she stood moments from death, was the boldest act of her short life. It was not loyalty to a king, but to the fleeting happiness that had made her feel alive. Her final confession turned the gallows into a pulpit, a place where she reclaimed her narrative. And then came the silence. The blade fell. The queen was no more. But her words remained etched in time, carried through centuries, not just as scandal, but as sorrow. They remind us that behind the jewels and titles was a young woman who wanted what all humans crave, to love and be loved in return. She died a queen, but she died above all as Catherine, a girl with a voice, a heart, and a truth too wild for the throne. The story of Catherine Howard is a fleeting melody, short-lived, yet echoing through the halls of history. Not simply because of her tragic death, but because of her desperate longing to live a life led by the heart. At just 19, she walked to the scaffold, not as a frightened girl, but as someone who had tasted love and dared to hold on to it right until the end. Catherine was no perfect heroine. She made mistakes. She loved recklessly. She trusted the wrong people. But what etches her name into history is not her flaws. It's the raw truth she uttered moments before death. I die a queen, but I would rather die the wife of Culpepper. The deeper lesson isn't about royal scandal or forbidden love. It's about the cost of silencing one's true self. In a world where being honest could get you killed, Catherine still chose to speak her truth. Her story reminds us power means nothing without peace of mind. Titles are hollow when the heart is in chains. We are not defined by crowns or status, but by the courage to live and love authentically, even if just for one final breath. So as the curtain closes on her story, let it open a reflection in ours. Live bravely, love truthfully, and never trade your soul for a throne.